Well, you can see that we have a few extra faces up here on the rostrum this morning. And I originally, a few weeks ago, had asked our school principal, Leu Milam, to share with us this week a sermon. And earlier this week, he called me and said that he and Randy Hill and Leu Wilson had put on a program at the Hood River Church last week, and he said, this is much better than what I could do by myself. So I said, well, that's great. We'll get 3 for the price of 1. So we welcome our Hood River brothers with us today, and we pray God's blessings as they share with us today.
Good morning. It's the time of season, or time of the year rather, that we're thinking about how God has led us. We're thinking about the things that we're thankful for, the many blessings that we've received, and we're always very thankful for family that we can be close to, and we're thankful in our family for some additional friends to our family that have come along with us for the weekend. You hopefully have the opportunity to meet them after the service. It really is a time to reflect on God's leading in our life and in our lives. And the 3 of us are here to share with you a little bit about God's leading. One will be a personal story that I'll be sharing from my background. And all of us have stories, if we stop to consider and think about that, where we can look and see how God has led in our lives very specifically. In fact, we have a quote from Ellen White that I think of quite often that's very famous, and that is that we only need to fear for the future as we forget how God has led us in the past. And so it's very important for us to take times and to think and reflect on how God has led us, and to spend some effort on it, not just say, oh, God led, but to really try to understand perhaps how he led. And that's part of my exercise today. He's also led us as a church, as a local church community. And Dale Milam will be sharing a story that many of you have been involved in, and most of you have been intimately involved in. He's also led us in stories that we look at in history and from the Bible. And Randy Hill will be sharing with us a story from biblical history where God had led. It was the best of times. For me, it was a great time because I was going to work in a new job out on the coast in Oregon, Tillamook, Oregon, to be exact. And I don't know if many of you have been out there, but there's some big hangars. There used to be 2 large hangars out on the airfield out there that were built at the beginning of World War II for our coastal patrol, for blimp hangars. They were housing blimps. And there was going to be coastal patrol there during the war. In one of those hangars, my best friend that I grew up with, had just gotten a job as he graduated from Walla Walla and working on a project for a company called Aerolift. The project was building a heavy lift vehicle primarily for the logging industry. It was called a cyclocrane. It was a large blimp that was designed to do vertical lifts of very heavy weights to be able to do remote logging. It was exciting work. It was very different than most people have an opportunity to work on in their lifetime in this day and age. It's very different. I worked for, the president of our company was Art Crimmins, and he was a wonderful leader. He could really inspire us to to work hard, to accomplish much, and he had many good ways of helping us feel like a team. I was excited to be out there because I was going to be able to spend time with my friend. I was going to work on this neat project. I was going to learn some neat things that I hadn't ever been exposed to before. And as I worked there, I became well-liked and appreciated for the work I was doing, and so that made it even nicer to be there. People liked me. The guys I worked with liked me. And I thought we had a great future ahead of us. I thought we had a wonderful future ahead of us, in fact, and I was really excited about where we were headed, about this project that was going to help with many different things, but personally it was going to help me in my career growth. It was going to help me to earn some decent money over life, because if the project was successful, well, we were promised that things would go well for us and all these kinds of things. So we were excited. All of us were excited. We were a pretty young group of people too. Don Doolittle was the head engineer. He was a retired engineer from American Engineering. He had owned American Engineering. He designed the arresting gear for aircraft carriers and things like that. It had done some very, very exciting engineering projects. Art Crimmins, as I mentioned, was a great leader, and there were many others that we worked with that had a fair amount of experience. Some of them a great deal of experience. This was a big project, and we were perhaps a bit naive about what it took to get things marketed, about infrastructure required to move a project like this ahead, about potential hazards we might run into with a large cyclocrane, which was a large blimp, and housing it in the hangar and moving it from hangars and things like that. But at the time, we were still very excited. We hadn't covered a lot of ground that we might be covering in the future, and so we were moving forward very optimistically.
I have to take just a moment to say something here. Looking out over the audience today, I feel like we're somehow having a Mid-Columbia Adventist school reunion, because I start looking here at how many people are here that used to be students there that I've had, which, Wes, don't get any ideas, okay? Wes already insulted me today about how old I was, and so I walked right into this one, didn't I? So. Is that better? All right. Now it's just getting me. It's got these neat little holes right up here on top. It was the best of times, and it was an exciting time. And in fact, it was one of the most exciting times that I've been through professionally. And I had been looking forward to this time for, 4 or 5 years, it seemed like. Now, this is really going to sound historical. Wes has me thinking this way all day now. Back in 1992, my family and I moved from the East Coast here. We were very excited about that move. Many of you have heard me refer to kind of the process that happened getting us out this way. And we really felt the Lord was leading us, and it's very, very exciting when you know that God is leading. When you have that confidence to know that not only have you put your trust in God, but that He's showing you, He's giving you clear evidence that you are doing what He wants you to be doing, where He wants you to be doing that. But I have to admit, there were times where I wondered. When we first rolled into Hood River trying to find a place to live, I wondered. As the months went by and we didn't have a place to live, I wondered if, I should make that same plea of, have you let us out here into the desert? Not that it looked like a desert at all, but, we really need a place to live, Lord. One of the other things that as a couple of years went by that I wondered about, many of you recall that multi-purpose room downstairs at the school served as my classroom. For 5 long years, it served as a classroom. And it was a difficult thing to use that. I see Chad back there nodding his head, because it also was the hallway to get to another classroom, and the kitchen was right off of there. And at some point we added a little office in down there. And so there were interruptions that happened that really kind of took their toll on there being some fluidness to what was happening in the classroom. And as a teacher, it was frustrating at times. And I really had looked forward to the possibility of there being an actual classroom to be in at some time. But that was one of the prices for growth that our church and school community were willing to pay, because our school was growing. It had gone from an 8th grade school to 1st to 9th to a K to 10 school in just a few years. And because of that, attracting more students. And we needed the space, and that was exciting. It really was the neatest of things. And it was exciting as plans began to come together on what to do about that. I remember sketches on the back of photocopied pieces of paper, of, well, maybe we could add on this way. And you might remember there were other necessities that kind of brought this about. Now, some of you have been around long enough, maybe even in your memory, you remember the school better for what it used to look like than what it looks like today. And the school, for those of you who don't remember, had kind of a flat roof. It just had a small pitch to it, which wasn't a problem because there were beams in there about 18 inches by about 3 or 4 inches. Huge beams in there. But one of the challenges with that roof was taking care of leaks, and we seemed to constantly be calling someone to come and patch some leaks there. And in fact, one day, fortunately, it happened when the lower grade students were at recess, and some of you, like Seth and Amber, you were students in that classroom at the time that this happened probably. You folks were at recess, and we had one of those leaks, and it was coming in and somehow got to the wiring that went to one of those big lights that was hanging in there, and a light bulb just exploded. And Carol Bovee came back to her classroom and found this pile of shattered glass on the floor. And so there were definite things. We needed the space. We needed to take care of a leaking roof, and we knew that. And both churches and the school, we really started pulling together on these plans. And any of you who have been involved in any kind of a building project of your own or remember the details of this one, you remember it's a neat thing. You start seeing things on paper and you start picturing these things in your mind and you start realizing some of the advantages that you're going to have. And it can be just really, really neat. And it also can be one of those times where our excitement causes us maybe to overlook a few things. And maybe in our excitement, we overlooked a few things, like the amount of effort it really was going to take to accomplish this task, or maybe the finances that were involved, or even some of the obstacles that we were sure to encounter along the way. But my goodness, was it ever an exciting time.
I can't tell if I am. I can hear myself. It truly was the best of times. But I have to tell you that the effect of it was like being in a room with 100 chefs chopping onions. I couldn't help it. Have you ever sat next to somebody whose bathing habits weren't real good? It repulsed me. It drove me nuts. I don't remember how old I was when I recognized that I was different. But I was different. I could tell when my brothers were coming home hours before they got there because the smell of them would assault me. It would insult me. I couldn't take it. I could tell, oh, here they come. And, most of you grew up in homes where your parents taught you to wipe your feet before you came into the house. My brothers worked in the fields. And while they did wipe their feet, the smell of the fields was in them, on them, over them, around them. And I couldn't take it, and I was so glad that I was different. I was different. You see, I was the favorite son. And the favorite son had certain privileges. I got to wear nice, clean clothes. And I did not have to do the things that my brothers did. And I was so thankful. It was truly the best of times. I was being tutored. The tutor would come and teach me how it is that you run a family, that you run a business, selling all of the things, all of the goods that our family would barter and trade on. And my job one day was to be in charge of the family. And I looked forward to it. Truly, it was the best of times. All except the smell. the smell was really pretty bad. Sometimes we're naive in life. Things are going so well, we think that's the way it's always going to be. Some of you were raised that way. Some of you have experienced the same things that I've experienced. Maybe you were born to a family that had money. It's not your fault. I won't fault you for that. Truly, that's the way it was for me. I would get up in the morning, I would make sure I had combed my hair and put on clean clothes, did all of the things I'm supposed to do, and I would watch my brothers who had slept in their clothes get up, scratch themselves, and head out the door. Maybe some of you were born poor. I don't fault you for that either. It's just your lot in life. You shouldn't be blamed. I don't blame you. It's just the way it is. It was the best of times.
It was the worst of times. At one point, after I'd been at Aerolift out there for about, I think it was about 9 months, we raised a tower, a big logging tower raised by Goofy George Churchill. He owned a logging company out in Tillamook, and he loved to be called Goofy George. He was about 60 years old at the time. His son Dave was about 30. And George could outclimb Dave over these towers and lines and everything all day long. It was amazing to watch this man. He had a sense of humor that wouldn't stop. And when we needed help, he loved to bring his crew out and help us with anything that he could have his crew help us with. And we needed to raise this 100-foot tower. I don't know what you call that kind of a tower, but it's one of those towers that you pull logs up to. And so he put it out there on the end of on the north end of the airport at Tillamook, on a big old pad that was out there. And raising that without anything else around to pull from, just trucks and stuff, that was quite a job, and we were pretty amazed to watch him and his crew working on that and getting it together. We also, the purpose in that tower was it was there to moor the cyclocrane to. We were going to do some of our static testing from that point. We could hook the nose of the cyclocrane up to that, and the cyclocrane would rotate. Could rotate in place, and through its rotational action and the winglets on the end of some structure, it could generate vertical lift without any forward motion. So we had a lot of testing we needed to do, and we would slowly take the cyclocrane out to that mast from the hangar. It would take us a couple hours to get it just a half a mile, probably about a quarter of a mile or so, from the hangar out to that pad. And we worked it very carefully. We were very careful about wind conditions. And we'd get the cyclocrane moored out there, and then we would get prepared to do testing. As you can imagine, in any flight test program, you take things very, very slowly. You only do one little thing at a time and make sure that everything's going to work well. So we were in the process of this testing strategy. And one day we had the cyclocrane out there, and a little bit of wind came up in the afternoon, and we discussed, Art and Don really discussed whether or not we should bring the craft back in. Well, the decision was made that with the little bit of wind there, it was safer to have it moored out on the tower. And the winds were predicted to go up, but it would be better to have it moored where it was attached to something rather than having us trying to handle it and with very little attachment or very little way to control it in any wind, trying to get it back to the hangar. And so that evening, we were all a little bit nervous. In fact, nervous enough that most of us were calling in and checking in and driving by. I lived close by. We were driving by to see what was happening. And as the night went on, the winds kept coming up higher and higher. In fact, they got to the point where they were about 120-mile-an-hour winds. And the cyclocrane was riding it out. We were not very confident it was going to continue to ride it out, but it was riding it out until about 10 o'clock the next morning, at which point the mooring point on the front structure of the cyclocrane finally gave way, and it crashed. It just tore itself apart, went across the road into the field across the roadway from the airport, and it was basically just spread out across the field in pieces. We were pretty discouraged. In fact, we were out there walking around in winds that required us to lean into the wind as hard as we could just to walk, trying to pick up pieces, trying to lash things down so that they wouldn't cause any more damage to people's property if pieces got away in the wind, trying to make sure we kept stuff around so that we didn't know what we would do with it, but we could do something with it, hopefully. At the same time, I learned some lessons, though, about the ability to move forward. Art, at the moment the thing pulled away, was making decisions about how he was going to move forward, and it was within a few hours that he was announcing to us that we were going to be moving forward. We were going to rebuild this thing. We had some insurance money that we could move forward with a rebuild on, and so we didn't know, especially those of us in the crew who had put a lot into this, worked at wages that reflected less than the going rate and things like that in order to be involved with this exciting project. We didn't really know what to expect, but we did know that we were going to move forward. We were going to move forward with a rebuild. But we were moving forward with some pretty heavy hearts because a lot of work, and I'd only been involved for a few months. Some of these guys had been working on this project back in Maryland before it moved out to Tillamook. They'd been working on it for, I think, at this point, 3.5 years. 3.5 years of work just destroyed in the field. We were pretty discouraged at that point, but we were going to move forward.
It really was the worst of times. I don't know if you can imagine standing in your place of work, especially if you work in an office, and having water just dripping all around you. And you're in the basement. And there's no plumbing. And so after school had gotten out that summer, we started part of the process that I enjoy the most when it comes to remodeling, and that's the demolition part. Seth, you understand that, don't you? Seth's always asking me how we can blow things up. We didn't blow things up, but we sure tore things up, didn't we? Some of you were involved in that process. Remember that? Remember how that roofing came off? And remember when those big beams in there, we first saw them? Most of us had never seen that, didn't know that that's the kind of structure that was underneath that roof. Remember the piles of stuff that was hauled out of there. Insulation and more insulation. And we had gotten that roof completely off of the school. Both classrooms there on the main floor, the restrooms, the storage room, they were all exposed. When I say exposed, you could walk into the building and look up and see the sky. Completely gone, the roof was. And I remember waking up one night, hearing the rain, and knowing that that's the condition our school was in. And sort of just waiting for daylight to head over there to see what really had happened, somehow hoping that maybe there had been a hole in those rain clouds right above the school and that the rain wasn't coming in there. You know, you think kind of silly things when you know bad things are happening and there's nothing you can do about it. And I remember that feeling, standing there in the school office in the basement with water just dripping all over. Walked into the multi-purpose room, water dripping everywhere. Walking into that back classroom, same story. The only places that seemed somewhat protected were the library, the kitchen, and the furnace room. They seemed to be under enough of what was left of portions of the roof not to have too much water in it. kind of hard to figure out what to do with, several thousand square feet of open roof when it's raining. And if you remember that, you remember it wasn't just one of those kind of foggy, drizzly kinds of rain. It was the kind of stuff that we get this time of year, although don't use this year as an example. It was just coming down, as close to pouring as it usually gets around here. And it was just so discouraging. Here we had planned. We knew that we needed to wait and do this during the summertime. We knew that this was going to expose the school to the elements, but we also thought that we had picked the best time of year to do this. And, what do? You stand there, you let things get wet, and you hope and pray that something good will come out of it. But it was so discouraging.
It was the worst of times. If you're going to be a leader, you have to know what's going on out in the field. Generals must go and inspect the troops. Go to Shechem, my dad said. Check on your brothers. Count how many sheep we have, he said. Go. Checking on my brothers, well, that I could put up with, but those sheep. So, I saddled up my donkey, put on some clean clothes, and I went to Shechem. And I knew before I got there that they weren't there. And so I started looking around for them, and somebody said, they've gone to Dothan. And so I started heading towards Dothan. I was 3 miles away when I knew where they were. I could smell them. All you've got to do is follow the smell of those stinky sheep, and you'll find them. Before I came up and over the hill, I knew they were on the other side. I got to the top of the hill, and my brothers saw me. And they acted excited. They wanted me to come. They wanted to give me hugs. Have you ever hugged somebody that hasn't had a bath in a week? I didn't look forward to that at all. And when I got close, instead of hugs, I got lynched. And I got stuck down in the bottom of this pit. Now, when you are not popular because of your status in life, because you are favored, you expect sick jokes. And my brothers had played them on me plenty of times. And I knew, laugh, go along with it, they'll get their laugh, it'll be over. And so I thought, okay guys, I'll get down in the pit. Got down there and I heard them chuckling. And I heard coins being tossed back and forth. And I thought, okay, it's almost over. And the rope came down. I thought, okay, good. I can go home now. And I can get out of here. I've done my thing. I'm on my way. And I climbed up the rope. And the next thing I knew, I was put in a place that was worse than sheep smell. You see, when I had studied from my tutor, I had seen pictures of slaves being hauled off. And they're riding on the camel with their hands tied. That's not the way it works. Yeah, your hands are tied, but you're not on top of the camel. You're being dragged behind the camel. Not 20 yards back, not 10 yards back, not 5 yards back. You're just right there close to the rear end of that camel, and you've got to walk. And it's stinkier there than sheep. It truly was the worst of times. How long would you walk behind a camel before you prayed that prayer that you've prayed before? I prayed it, but it took me 4 or 5 days before I prayed it because I kept thinking that the joke would be over soon. And then I said, Lord, if you would just get me out of this situation. I'll do anything. Have you prayed that prayer? We always pray it when it's the worst of times.
We were moving forward with the rebuild. It took us a couple of years, but we rebuilt the cyclocrane. Over that couple of years, I get to know the guys on our crew better. We actually had some other guys come on, a couple guys who ended up leaving during that period of time. Got to know Hunter Harris, a pilot who could fly just about anything, was rated to fly anything that I know of, and he could fly so well. I would fly with him in a moment's notice, and in fact, since those days when I've had jobs where I could get him involved in the flying aspect of it, I've had him. He's such a good pilot back in Maryland. Chris Wagner, he was kind of our class clown type of guy. He could make you laugh anytime, any place. But he's a good-hearted guy, a hard worker, and in fact, at one time I have a fond memory of going out in a sling. I was in the hangar and I needed to repair something on the front of the cyclocrane bag, and inside the blimp structure is helium. So I had to take off a fixture and replace it with another fixture. While that fixture was off, helium is pouring out of the bag into the area where I am, and we didn't have supplemental oxygen for me to breathe, so I was breathing a high percentage of helium. And over that period of very few minutes, I was able to get the fixture back on, but I was very, very weak as a result of that. And Chris had me on a rope, I was in a sling and a rope, and Chris hauled me up over the side of the railing where he had to haul me, and helped me get back on my feet there and rest until I could take myself down the stairs in the hangar there under my own power. We had a machinist, Ken Kipke. He was a surly guy, had a heart of gold, but boy, you sure couldn't tell it if you just talked to him at first. We had an incredible wealth of neat people, and we became, over those 2 years, much more of a family than just a professional team of people working together. We had Bob Kaufman. He was our 57-year-old teenager. He had lived with the same lady sort of off and on, I think, since he was about 25, and they'd never quite figured out that it would be a good idea to get married, and he still drove a 1957 Corvette. And anyway, I could go on and on with stories about these guys, all very interesting characters. In fact, characters is somewhat of an understatement. They all had very funny aspects about them. As we moved forward with this rebuild, we came up to the time that we were going to start our testing program. In fact, we started our testing program again with the rebuilt cyclocrane. And as we started into the testing program, there was 4 of us. My friend that I'd originally gone to work there, his wife, Karen Moss, my friend's name was Reg Moss, and another friend of ours, Doug Osmus, that had all come to work for this company. We were all Seventh-day Adventists. And we'd made it very clear up front what our work availability would be. And that wasn't an issue. We were valued for what we were doing, and we were well liked. We were an integrated part of the team, and everybody worked around our needs, and they worked around the other guys. We worked around various needs of other guys, too. But as the testing time began, money began to be a little bit more of a problem there at the cyclocrane project, on the cyclocrane. And there was some noise about needing to be available for testing at a moment's notice, 7 days a week. We reiterated our position to Art Crimmins at that point. Reg wrote a letter, and we thought everything was resolved. There was a little bit of tension, and then we had a company party, really, and Art made an arrangement with us, and we basically volunteered to work at a reduced level of salary because we weren't going to be available on Sabbaths, and we felt that in order to help the project move forward, that would be something we could do. And we also offered to try to start helping find people who could possibly replace us. as time went on, and as things got a little bit more difficult, tensions got a little bit higher, but again, we were working well. One Sabbath afternoon, though, we had a problem that came up, and one of the control systems on the cyclocrane was malfunctioning, and it was actually taking one of the controls and cycling it so that it was starting to tear up one of the structures. And so we were key to that element of it, and so we rushed down there, got things stabilized so it wouldn't get torn up, and then came back and got everything fixed up that evening, I believe, as I recall. Well, that was what we considered an emergency. And Art thought about that, and he thought, well, we're really in an emergency situation here in this testing phase. If we don't get things tested when we have the time of when the weather cooperates, we're going to have a problem on our hands. We really have an emergency situation. And so he called a meeting, and Art was a very smart, very capable, very controlling, and very manipulative person when he chose to be. He had advanced in the professional world partly due to these qualities. He was also an excellent leader. But he decided that the best way for him to pressure us, he obviously couldn't pressure us with finances because we'd already worked that issue out with him. He decided the best way to pressure us might be to bring the whole company together. He knew he'd built a team, he'd built a family, and he knew that it would be very difficult for us to look our family members in the eyes and say, no, we can't help you at this point with that particular requirement. He brought the board members in also to that meeting, and the board members had been very supportive of us in our career growth and professional growth. We knew that this was coming up one day. We heard about it through one of the guys that this was going to be happening. We didn't know the extent of what was going to happen, but so Reg, Karen, Doug, and I went and had a meeting at lunchtime and decided how we would approach things when this came up. We were under quite a bit of stress at that point, not because we were wondering about what to do, because we knew what we needed to do, but because we were really struggling with how to deal with our friends and how we could present ourselves in a way that they would not feel that we had let them down. We went to a meeting on I don't remember what day it was now, in the afternoon, and Art was there, and he started to explain the situation, and we explained that in return that we would be happy to step out of the company, to move out of the way so that others could come in and replace us so that he could move forward. We would be happy to do whatever he needed in order to move forward, but we could not and would not be available for a planned test exercise on Sabbath during the Sabbath hours. He turned red in the face. His fists were clenched. He was absolutely furious. And everybody was sitting around that room looking at us, and they couldn't believe their eyes. And we felt pretty stressed. We didn't know quite what to do. We weren't able to just calmly talk. We were speaking our piece, our part of the discussing our options under a lot of stress, and it told. Art decided, because of legal grounds and whatever, that he could not fire us at that point. We had offered to leave, but he wouldn't do that either. So what he did was he shut the company down one day. I think it was on a Thursday. Basically shut the company down, laid everybody off in the company. On Monday, opened the company back up and hired everybody back in except for the four of us. Pretty clear what he was doing, and we didn't complain about it. We knew what he was doing. He then took the cyclocrane out for testing when it was available and really, truly tried to test on Sabbath. He would go out. I lived nearby. He would go out every Sabbath, or he and the crew would go out. They'd have the cyclocrane out there where they were going to get ready for tests, and the wind would come up every Sabbath it came up. They never flew a Sabbath test. Never flew a Sabbath test. Finally, because of the pressures on Art, he started making some other very unwise decisions, and the project was shut down in total. He was removed from the project. We had moved forward with a lot of excitement about what was going to be happening, and we sure, especially the four of us, were just really torn up that things had still not completely pulled together the way we had anticipated and hoped.
We didn't stand around with water dripping on our heads for long. In fact, as I remember that morning, Elena, I'm glad you made it back. As I remember that morning, people started showing up. People who hadn't been there at the school building project before, but they just started showing up. People started showing up with big rolls of plastic and just saying, "What can I do?" and grabbing tarps. And there were people climbing all over that building, stapling plastic down and putting tarps over copy machines and computers and teachers' desks. And amazingly, there was very little damaged in that rainstorm. And the project did move ahead. I don't know about you, but I'm one of these people who doesn't particularly enjoy the roller coaster rides at amusement parks, and I don't particularly enjoy them in life either. I kind of like steady as she goes. I like being able to get up in the middle of the night with the lights turned off and know I could walk and find a chair and sit down because it's where it's always been. I'm just one of those people. And this project didn't always lend itself to that kind of person because there were ups and downs. You know, things would start looking good, and then something would happen. One thing that it seemed like we could always count on, though, was the people that were involved. And you know, I mentioned Elena, and you know, I'm happy that she's here to hear some of this. But you know, Elena was there every day. Jeffrey was there every day. Their friend Jeff Thompson, Jim Rickabaugh. I remember still the sign language that Jeff used for you. You know, he'd come in. Jeffrey would come in, and you know, is Jim here? You know. And what was the sign he would use for Kelly Winston? Kelly always had his hard hat on. What was, you know, his hard hat, you know? And Kelly Winston was there. Many of you know him. In fact, you know, in that early part of the demolition phase of that project, I'm one of these people that has terrible problem with allergies. And I remember them getting in there into that insulation. And this was that blown-in kind of stuff that if you could put all the pieces back together, you were probably reading a newspaper from 1930-something. And, you know, it was just that dusty, shredded-up mess. And Kelly and others would climb into that space with big tarps and just pile this stuff onto the tarps. And then they would pull it out. And the other thing that we did expect this time of year is the wind. And they would get that thing out and open it up to try and dump it. And the wind was just carrying that around. I really wonder what our neighbors thought at times. You know, fortunately, most of the time the wind blew in a direction that gave that whole back field, you know, the chance to collect the dust that we were making before it got into someone's house. But, you know, there just was incredible help there. And many of you were that help. Many of you were bringing food. We didn't even see you, but we sure tasted the wonderful food that you'd bring. It would show up there every day. We didn't have to worry about food. We'd walk down into the basement, and Jeffrey would pick up his 10 rolls and lick them so nobody else would take them off his plate, and we'd go ahead and eat. You know? You remember that, don't you? And yet it just seemed this roller coaster ride, you know. The ups were fabulous, but the downs were terrible. And I remember coming back from a planned vacation and talking to Elena, and she says, "Boy, do I ever have to talk to you." And I knew it was one of those talks where it wasn't necessarily going to be fun and positive. And she said, "We met the building inspector while you were away." And, boy, that's okay. You go right ahead. Just don't get me started, okay? We ran into trouble. You know, we had just started a roofing project was really all that we really had intended. And the novices that we were, we really didn't think ahead about, you know, how involved this project was going to be, and that really we probably should have talked to the building inspector, you know. And He drove, yeah, we had, but they had changed building inspectors too. And he drove by one day and saw the size of this project and decided it was time for him to be involved. And like I say, I was glad I wasn't there, but unfortunately Elena had to deal with that, and he was very upset at us. He got over it though. We'll get to that part later, but absolutely. Things moved ahead, trusses were getting in place. We could begin to visualize in reality what was happening here, and yet bad things would happen. We'd start talking to this inspector about things, and he'd be saying, well, what about your sprinkler system? And we were saying, sprinkler system? What are you talking about? And so then we started looking into those things, and then they started talking about the fire alarm system that we had, and that it wasn't adequate, and how involved a system that we might need to have. And then we started realizing how involved the electrical part of this project was, much bigger than we wanted. And even some of the plumbing got a little complicated, didn't it, Jim? Still I go up in that attic and there's a giant plumbing octopus up there. And then there was just the overwhelming costs. And I pride myself in being what I call a realist. To optimists, I'm a pessimist. To pessimists, I'm an optimist. But somewhere in between is where I like to be. But we were again probably naive about the financial costs involved, and the costs just kept increasing, and we kept wondering, how are we going to do this? This is a project we all wanted. This is a project we prayed about. This is a project that needed to take place. But certainly the financial costs, how are we going to be able to do this? How are two churches in a school that often struggle with these kinds of costs going to be able to handle this? And we did a lot of praying. We trusted the Lord to lead. And we continued to ride the roller coaster.
Poor people have bad posture. Have you noticed that? Their shoulders slump, their eyes look down. The posture of a slave, if I could show you, would be to get lower than dirt and to humble yourself as much as you can. And that's how it was. To be treated the way a slave gets treated is not an experience I would wish on anyone. But slowly, over time, I was able to stand again. And I almost got to look up before I got cast even lower. 2 years in prison really changes you. If there's a smell worse than sheep, it's the back end of a camel. If there's a smell worse than that, it's the floor of a prison. And for 2 years, over 2 years, I spent time in prison. Every night, I went to bed listening to the cries of men in physical pain from the beatings they were getting, and I woke up in the morning to the cries of men with mental pain for what they had gone through. It's no fun being in prison. It is got to be the worst place conceivable. Every shred of hope flies out those barred windows. And even when you do good, it's forgotten. At least that's how it felt. That's how it felt utterly and completely. The cupbearer forgot me. And for 2 years, I prayed the same prayer. Lord, if you'll just get me out of this one, I'll do anything.
Well, after the project was shut down, Reg and Karen and Doug and myself and most of the other guys found other jobs. But a few months later, I received a phone call, and as it turned out, the board of directors had arranged and hired another person to run the company. They'd pulled together some additional financing, and they were calling people back. In fact, they started by calling me and Doug and Reg and Karen, the first people to have gone. But we were the first on the phone list to call back. And in each of our cases except one, we opted to come back. It was a project we were deeply in love with. It's hard to explain those kinds of projects, I suppose. But after you've invested yourself so heavily into a project like that, to have the opportunity to come back and to try to make it a success is something that you don't often have the opportunity to do, and for me it wasn't really much of a decision. I wanted to go back. We came back, we worked for a while, and unfortunately, I have to say that eventually the project I ended up leaving that project, and sometime after I left, not because I left, but sometime after I left, the project ended up being shut down. And if you were to go out to Tillamook a few years ago, you could have still seen the parts of the cyclocrane there in the hangar. Since then, it's been dismantled entirely. But as I reflect back on the situation, before that first dark, dreary night, as we were entering the testing program, had we gone and had to face that Sabbath issue at that point, after only having been there a few months, it wouldn't have had nearly the impact on the people that we were dealing with that it had after having been there a couple more years. We had built up much more of a family relationship by that point in time, and people were asking us, why, what? Had it happened earlier, we probably would have been, a few people might have asked why or what, but we probably would have just been out the door and people would have thought, well, that's too bad. But it's very difficult. It was very difficult for these guys to see this happen, and they became we're still pretty good friends with all of them, and they ask those questions, why or what, and I'm convinced it's because of that amount of time. Also, during that time, as I mentioned, Art was a great leader. He unfortunately made some mistakes, but he taught me many things. I learned many things about sticking to it, about how to build a team, how to work with a team, that I still use today, that I use, in fact, more today than I perhaps have ever before, because I have my own business now that I can apply those to. Also, I learned a lot about what it takes to get a project off the ground, how to make it move. Infrastructure requirements, the scope of projects, how big it is, and the way the complications you might run into. My naivety now is much less than it would have been, or it was prior to that. Also, during those additional years, I started to learn, I started really enhancing some of the technical skills that I use today. In fact, that my business is built on today. And had I not had that opportunity, I'm not sure that I'd be in the kind of business I am in today. And I love what I do today. And so what appeared as a major discouraging experience for me when the first cyclocrane was torn to pieces, and the devil may have been behind it, he may not have, I don't know at this point, but what was a very discouraging situation for me and for my friends, God took and turned it into ultimately a very good situation for me and my friends. And we all look back on that experience with a great deal of awe and wonder at how God can lead through what we sometimes don't see as His leading.
I hope you're not one of these folks that when something bad happens, you look to God and say, God, why did you do this to me? I think it's a shame that we forget oftentimes that God wants good for us. And it's Satan who is smiling from ear to ear when the bad things happen. And most of you would recognize, most of you, even the younger ones, have had enough trials in your life that you would recognize that often when we continue to trust in God, when we put our faith in Him, there's something good that can come out of even these negative situations that come our way. And that we hang on to that faith and we look and we find that God is just incredible. God is good. And He can work miracles. Not magic. He works miracles out of what happens. Standing in that office that morning with the rain dripping around, in kind of a stupor. But, in a few minutes I started looking and where there was no water dripping? There was no water dripping over the computer. There was no water dripping over my desk. There was no water over the copy machine, over the file cabinets with the permanent records, over all the computers in the classroom. But every place else, the water was just coming in. We got tarps, we covered those things up, and guess where water started coming in? Over top of the desk, over top of the computers, over top of the file cabinets and the copy machines and every other item that had been previously dry and was now covered. God is good. God takes care of us. And all we have to do is look. And now I know that sometimes we have to be patient. But God is so good. That inspector came and he was so angry, wasn't he? He was so upset over what was going on here and that somehow things weren't going the way that he had hoped. But as time went by, just in a few short days, even in that first visit of his there, he started recognizing that we weren't bad people and that we were people who really wanted to do things right and work with him. And he appreciated that and he recognized that. And over the length of that project, that was such a positive thing so many times. One of our biggest problems was dealing with this sprinkler system and this alarm system. And the state fire marshals in Salem absolutely insisted that we had to have a sprinkler system. And since we were starting into a project on the school, that we had to make sure that this happened not just in the new construction, but throughout the whole building. And we talked to these folks, and we tried our best. And I remember putting my best negotiating skills at work with these folks, trying to get them to understand that they didn't understand this situation and that it really didn't fit what we were doing and that we really didn't need to do that. And at one point, our local building inspector came to us and said, there's a change that's going to take place, and I think this may help you. And that change is that the authority to determine whether these kinds of things have to happen will be changed from the state level in Salem to the local level with the building inspector and the local fire marshal. And we just praised the Lord. And that change did happen. And he was probably more meticulous in looking at what the law required than even those fire marshals sitting at their desks in Salem. But he was also willing to come and take a look at what we had and to realize that what they were insisting on without a knowledge of our situation didn't apply at all. And many of you remember people standing up here saying, "Praise the Lord." They have told us we do not have to do a sprinkler system. Do you remember hearing those words? Do you remember the feeling of that? God is so good. The insurance adjuster, when I called them that day about the rain, just hoping, I honestly was thinking, what insurance company in their right mind is going to help us with a project when we pulled the roof off of it? If you pull the cork out of the submarine and it sinks, do they pay you for the submarine? And I remember talking to them and they said, "Well, did you do anything to cover it?" And I said, "Well, yeah." I said, "We got plastic and we got up on there and covered as much as we could and covered up equipment." And they said, "Well, how did you cover it?" And I'm thinking to myself, well, I laid it down and we stapled it and, and they wanted some details. And so we shared those details with them. And they said, it sounds like you did that exactly the way you're supposed to do. I think we can help you. And help us they did. The only things that got ruined were things we wanted to replace anyway. And they made a payment to us for quite a bit of money for the damage to things that, like I said, we didn't feel too badly about replacing anyway. And all of a sudden, that financial picture didn't look quite so gloomy as it had before. Along in the process, please say that as many times as you like, because it is. And how many times can I tell you that God is good? And I hope that you continue to recognize that. One day, Jeff T. was up on the roof, and he was pulling away some of the siding because the new roof was going to join up to the gymnasium. And when he pulled it aside, at the end of those beams that are up in the roof, kind of like these beams are here, except in the school, they're just sort of a big arched laminate beam that sits in a big steel kind of saddle up there. And at the end of that beam was nothing but rotted wood. And so he started poking around in there and poking around in there and poking around in there until he had measured, 11 inches of rotten wood on a 12-inch saddle. I mean, do you get the picture? That roof was being held up at least in a few places by an inch of good wood. We would have never known that had we not started into this project. Somewhere along the line, you would have been part of or heard or read or seen on the news a news story about a roof of a gymnasium that collapsed, hopefully overnight when kids weren't there. Possibly, best case scenario, possibly, when the gymnasium was full of kids playing. What looked like a disaster was a blessing. God was so good to us. Every time we turned around, every down in that roller coaster ride, God brought us back up. Every time that Satan tried to dash our hopes, God strengthened them and said, "You have nothing to fear because I am with you." Isn't it incredible how God works? Don't forget it, folks. Don't forget it. God is there. He loves you. He cares for you. He's worked amazing things in your lives before, and I guarantee you that negative things are going to continue to happen in your life. But I also guarantee you that there is nothing that God can't handle. And when you choose to be on God's team, you have won.
If you were smitten with a disease which took away your sense of smell, took away your sense of taste, your sense of touch, how long could you stay cheerful? Best I can tell, it had been at least 10 years. Joseph had been waiting, wondering which day it would be that those brothers of his would show up for food. It was like a man who had had no sense of smell, no sense of taste, no sense of touch, stood there and watched these guys who had obviously been sleeping in those clothes overnight walk in front of him. And you think of your favorite smell. For me, it's chocolate. For him, it was the smell of sheep. He could not run fast enough to embrace them. He could not stand the thought of going one more moment without being close to those who he had once looked down upon. What an answer to prayer. What a way to end your life. And his was just beginning. What a way to be, to drink in the smell of sheep and have it be a good smell. What a wonderful experience. Then he shared something with his brothers. He said, "You meant evil, but God meant it for good." You see, I think that the story of Joseph isn't something that's just corporate for the family of Joseph. I think it was a personal story. I think it was the story of someone who needed to learn a lesson. And through the lesson, Joseph learned that he thought he was meant to be served because he was the favorite son, when in fact he needed to serve. And through the things that happened in his life, he got to serve soldiers, he got to serve prisoners, he got to serve another country and his family. Maybe the trials that you're going through in your life seem like they're just weighing so heavy on you. You are lower than dirt right now. Somehow, through these things that we learn in life, God teaches us the lessons that he wants us to know about. And for Joseph, the things that were meant for evil truly did end up to be for good.
It's when we take time to reflect on God's leading through the downs and the ups that we can say, like Paul, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. The Lord is near. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, shall guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Dear Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this season that we can dedicate to reflection on your leading in our lives personally, in our lives corporately, and through the lives of others that we can share. Please be with us now through the rest of these Sabbath hours. May our praise, may our worship bring honor and glory to your name, and may we at the end of this day be closer to you and more able to share your love with those around us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.